So, what's new this month? We've got a total of 69 feature releases this month so far, which is a fairly quiet month. And but what I wanted to talk through was what's been happening since the last meetup we had. So in December, January, and February, we've had a total of 329 feature releases and updates into AWS, which, because I've got a thing for graphs, looks a little bit like this. I'm not 100% sure if my February data is up to date yet, so we'll see what that number looks like at the end of the month and get that one up to date there. But we're going to take a couple of minutes and talk through some of the updates that have come out over the last couple of months that I was really keen to draw some attention to.
Got a big echo, apparently.
Big echo, that's wonderful. I'm going to edit this out of YouTube video, but let me just see.
Turn off the other room mics.
Has that corrected our echo at all? Yes, no.
I've got one on headphones. Just talk.
Just keep talking. See, February, I said February is always fun technical issues as we figure out why things are working the way that they are working. Save me one bit. Hit microphones. Okay, I'm still talking. Is there an echo there? I'm getting a thumbs up. Alright, JJ's there, it's fine. Nice. Right. So let's talk about what was new in December of 2021. How did we wrap up the year after reInvent? So the first one I want to talk to is the AWS Network Firewall now supports AWS managed firewall rules. So Network Firewall is a service that is completely managed and can run in your VPC and let you define your own layer 7 firewall rules to do things like blocking all outbound SMB traffic, as an example. Now, with these AWS managed rules, you can leverage the same kind of intelligence we use with the AWS WAF managed rule sets and bring those into your AWS Network Firewall, so you can not have to control all those rules yourself and get additional levels of security based on your application's needs. Next, introducing AWS Amplify Studio. So AWS Amplify is a set of tools that's designed to make it really easy for developers to go and create new applications. JJ's somewhere moving to try to figure out which one is speaking again. AWS Amplify Studio is a way for you to be able to create applications in a sort of drag and drop interface. So this has got parts of it that are in preview and parts of it that are sort of out in the wild. So you can design your backends using Amplify Studio, and using some of the preview features, you can drag and drop really common UI elements in and create a user interface as well. So the premise here is that we can bring this into a space where you can have really low-code application building with all of the building blocks that are part of the Amplify ecosystem. So this makes it really easy for a much broader range of people to start creating apps that run on AWS. Next, Amazon SageMaker Studio Lab, which is currently in preview, was released through December. And this one's really interesting. So Studio Lab is a completely free, no configuration machine learning service. So you can go into Studio Lab, you can sign in with a number of different account types, and start doing some machine learning with a free level of services around compute and storage. You don't even need an AWS account for this. Right? So you don't need to set up an AWS account and put in credit card details or anything. You can literally go there, sign up and sign in, and start learning machine learning practices and using some of the latest tools that are pre-installed in those environments. When you're done, it's as easy as closing the lid on your laptop and walking away. Next, Amazon RDS Custom for SQL Server was released. So RDS, our relational database service, is a really great way to be able to run common database products in the cloud and have relational database storage in the cloud, such as Microsoft SQL Server. But some of the feedback we got from customers was that the trade-off of a fully managed service versus not being able to have administrative access to the environment meant that things like third-party software couldn't be installed that was linked to a business's process. Now, RDS Custom is a sort of middle ground. So you still get an automated deployment and scaling and the benefits of RDS in that regard, but you have have the ability to have access to those machines so that you can install third-party software and drivers to be able to really configure the RDS instances to meet your application's needs. So if RDS was previously not an option for you because of some of those restrictions, RDS Custom might be worth looking at. All right, so from December, moving on into January 2022, and things that were released there. First one, you would have seen if you logged into an AWS account. We have a new console homepage. So the previous homepage has been replaced with a new one that is flexible and customizable with a number of widgets. So you can define it to look the way that you want. You can have your shortcuts to previously used services. We bring cost information in the cost widget or the recommendations from Trusted Advisor. They can all be configured and arranged in the way that best suits you. So there'll be more widgets that are added to this over time, but with this experience, you get a really customized look at the homepage that is genuinely useful to you and how you use your AWS account. Next, AWS Panorama is now available in a couple of additional regions, one of which being Sydney. So Panorama, if you've not seen it, is it's a physical appliance that we released that's designed to help do sort of visual inference and looking at images and videos on the device at the edge. So this is really great if you're in like a low bandwidth scenario where you can't stream all of your video sources back into the cloud. It's not practical to do so. I could have many video streams and looking at analyzing those with a Panorama appliance. So now you can get those and run them based out of the Sydney region. Next, AWS Resilience Hub has expanded to 13 additional regions, again, one of which is Sydney. So Resilience Hub was announced a little while back. It lets you go through and define what the resilience standards are for your application and start sort of tracking it and getting recommendations on how to improve it. So we can talk to what your recovery point objective and recovery time objectives might be for your application workload. And using Resilience Hub, we can start paying really close attention to that and getting recommendations on how to improve the resilience of your applications directly from this new service. And it's now available in the Sydney region. Next, AWS Step Functions adds mocking support for testing workflows locally. So one of the really common pieces of developer feedback that comes into us is around being able to work with services that behave like the cloud behaves, but from a local machine, because it gives you a much faster sort of iteration time on the things you're building. And so you've seen that with things like Stand Local as a really good example of running like AWS gateways and lambdas locally. Now with this Step Functions edition, you can run those locally and mock out what your integrations would do. So rather than actually running a Lambda function, for example, you can mock what the return value would be. So this is a really great way to test out things like the data flow through your step function and make sure that I've got my conditions right and the way that the data passes through the application right. And then when I'm ready, I can publish it up into AWS and start running it at scale. Now, moving on into February, like I said, there wasn't a lot of updates this month, but there were a few I wanted to call out as just really good standards of living kind of upgrades almost. And these are really great examples of that. The first one, Amazon VPC now supports an AWS managed prefix list for Amazon CloudFront. So, VPC prefix lists are ways of listing IP address ranges that are known for a particular purpose. So a really common example of that might be if you've got a range of IP addresses for your on-premises network and you're talking into something like a firewall that's in your VPC, you can just maintain a prefix list in one place and multiple things can take advantage of that to restrict traffic to that IP address range. Now, CloudFront is a really good example of where customers have done that. So if you've got, say, an application load balancer that sits behind the CloudFront distribution and you want to make sure that all the traffic comes from CloudFront, previously you would have had to write some code that checked for updates on that IP address list table, update your own prefix list or update your own security groups, and go from there. It's not a tremendous amount of code, but it was a bit of extra legwork. Now we do that for you. You can just refer to the AWS managed prefix list and it is always up to date. Next, AWS organizations now let you centrally manage alternate contacts in AWS accounts. So if you don't set up a lot of accounts, this might not be something you pay a whole lot of attention to, but when you create an account, you specify a range of alternate contacts, so a technical contact, a finance contact, there's a couple other ones in there as well. Now, having these set in the accounts makes it really easy for things like support engagement, and there's trusted advisor checks that will also go through and say, hey, have you set these contacts? Previously, you would have to do it one account at a time in a very manual way. Now, with AWS organizations and this update, you can specify what these contacts should be in one place, making it really easy to aggregate these values out across many accounts and just saving you time. And the next one I wanted to talk about was the general availability of AWS CloudFormation hooks. So CloudFormation is our infrastructure as code service. You create a CloudFormation template, you hand it to the service, and it goes and creates many different AWS resources for you. What CloudFormation hooks allows you to do is to be able to run code and check things ahead of a resource being created, updated, or deleted. So what this means is you can do things like, say, check for compliance standards. So I could say, run a hook before any S3 buckets get created, and make sure that all of those buckets meet specific criteria, like having encryption turned on, or block public access enabled. If not, CloudFormation will block that resource from being created, and will then trigger a rollback on the template. So this makes it really easy to start doing things like compliance within all of these different resources without having to try to inject that compliance into every single template within your account. The last couple for this month that I wanted to draw some attention to before we move on. AWS SSO has expanded support for customer compliance programs and now includes PCI DSS and IRAP protected. So IRAP being the Australian standard that a lot of Australian government customers look for, the protected level on the AWS SSO service now means that if you've got protected level data that will interact with that, you can go and investigate whether or not that service is right for you and your organization, leveraging this new compliance check to help inform that choice. And lastly, Amazon Code Guru Reviewer now detects Apache Log4j and other log injection vulnerabilities in code. So through December, if you were watching any of like Twitter or any IT-related news, you might have seen that there were some issues that came up in regards to, in particular, the Log4j library in Java around log injection vulnerabilities that were not great from a security standpoint. So they were ultimately patched, and if you've been patching your stuff, you've probably picked up a fix for that. But there's a bunch of things that you want to look at here in terms of ensuring that you're sanitizing values before you log them to help prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. So now Code Guru, for both Java and Python code, can start looking at how you're logging values that have been received from a user in, say, like a HTTP request, for example, like a query string or a header or a request, and making sure that they're going to be either inspected or modified before they're logged, so that you can look for the ones that are obvious risks and start tailoring your application to suit. So if you've not looked at Code Guru, there's another really great reason to look at that now. Alrighty, so white papers that have been released and updated this month, or on counting December and January towards this as well. There was 21 updates, which for 3 months worth is a bit of a quiet run, but it was Christmas and New Year's, so people took some time. There were a few that I wanted to draw your attention to though. The first one is the AWS well-architected framework and the pillar recently, the sustainability pillar. And this is all about creating applications that make really efficient use of resources to minimize the carbon footprint. So the sustainability pillar white paper talks through the kinds of questions we ask and the way we look at workloads in the cloud, specifically with that lens of sustainability in mind. Next, there was a replatforming .NET applications into Windows containers. So again, if you've got legacy applications running on premises that are leveraging .NET, this white paper can help you understand the strategies and techniques that you might use to migrate those into Windows-based containers running in the cloud. There was an update for implementing AWS WAF. Again, just a really great service. I like the service. I wanted to call out an update for that one. And the last one was around modern data architecture rationales on AWS. Again, that was another new white paper that's worth looking at if how you want to architect your data is important to you. But on that note, I'm going to wrap up here, and we're going to hand over to Paul Macey to give his presentation on accelerated data prep for analytics and machine learning on AWS. So stay with us for just a minute, and we'll be right back with Paul.
Hi everyone, I'm Paul Macey from the Data Foundry. I'm here to talk about accelerated data prep for analytics and ML on AWS. It's a topic that's very dear to our heart at the moment because the Data Foundry team have been working with customers who've had challenges with data preparation where data hasn't been that clean and it's been quite complex to declutter and denest. And tonight I'm really looking forward to showing you how we can actually unnest and prepare data without having to use any code at all using AWS Glue DataBrew. So I'm going to go through a little bit about who the Data Foundry are. I'm going to cover what data foundations are needed to have organisations trust and use data to produce new insights. I'm going to show you a couple of the data challenges that people have in organisations, and then I'm going to show you how we can use Glue DataBrew to solve most of those, including sensitivity of data and removing data when it's needed in the case of credit cards or personal information. So let's get going. So who are the Data Foundry? Well, everything we do is all about data. We're customer obsessed, just like AWS, and we work backwards with the customer to make sure that the end state of what a customer is looking for is where we want to get to. We don't go from building databases and then hoping at the end we're going to have something that the customer wants. We try to create a solution that the customer is excited by and it meets their use cases and their requirements. We don't just do data lakes. We build solutions that include transformations, reporting, and insights. But we just don't leave it there. We make sure the customers know how to use the tools and the services that we've used with AWS so that they can actually do their own work once we actually leave. We're AWS specialists. We actually don't use any other platform services. So whenever you engage us, you'll know that everything is focused on AWS services. And finally, we only work with public sector. So whether you're a utility, a university, federal or state government, we understand how you work as an organisation, as we've worked with many of those organisations across Australia. Okay, data foundations. When I work with customers, the foundation thing that an organisation looks for is trust, because without trust, there's no way we're going to be able to deliver any kind of benefit to the organisation, because they won't be able to trust the insights and make decisions, because they'll always be doubting or second guessing their actual data sets. So how do we solve for that? Well, to establish trust, what we do is we try our best to remove as much of the human interaction of data as it's being onboarded, prepared and processed so that the insights, whether it's traditional analytics or ML, those particular parts of an organisation is where you can actually focus your energy and actual exploration. So rather than trying to manage and transform data, you can spend more time investigating and exploring data to make better decisions using accurate data. There's this saying that says trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. And in the time that I've been doing data, which is over 20 years, I have to say that whenever I've seen multiple reports that are different in some small way, neither of those reports ever can be truly trusted. And most executives or business users of the data actually have to do the work themselves, and you find a lot of times they'll go and get the source data from a data provider and actually prepare the data themselves using tools like Excel or Access or some other foundational tool, because they don't trust any other part of the actual pipeline. And we need to find a way to actually remove that barrier. The trouble is, though, when we're working with data, and if we look at customers that the Data Foundry work with, a lot of times the data is dirty. And what I mean by that is that we can have data with invalid characters. In the case of dates, we may have commas, or we may have exclamation marks, or we may have even string values that make no sense. We may have missing data, or we may have data that is very, very complex, where data like JSON objects is deeply nested. And when you go to query the data, you'll find that within the nests of objects that are within that JSON object, there's some objects that are missing, some that are not fully complete, and it takes a lot of time to unnest, clean, and prepare the data so you can actually create it and make it available for consumption. Data preparation accounts for 80% of the work done by most data analysts and database administrators. They spend a lot of time writing SQL to transform data and remove special characters. For data scientists and machine learning specialists, they've got to actually map out data and find features, and a lot of that takes time. So rather than spending time on insights and exploration, 80% of the time, it's all about getting the data ready for actually doing that investigation. So most of you will be familiar with the different ways of working with data. In the past, most people were familiar with working with SQL. So whether it's with Microsoft or Oracle or some other brand, or even open source, you'd be writing SQL statements to drop columns, to trim data, to concatenate data, and so on. Then, over the last 5 to 10 years, Python and Java have really come of age, where there's libraries that have been created that are specific to solving particular data cleansing and data preparation challenges. And as we enter the world of big data, when we entered the world of big data, say 5 or 10 years ago as well, we started to see that there was MapReduce, and now in the last 5 years, we see Spark and Flink starting to be used to prepare data as well. Of course, there's still third-party tools where there's things like Microsoft SSIS, if you know that, or SAP Data Services, or even other products that allow you to do the transformation and ETL of data. They're all great. The challenge is you've got to buy more products, you've got to install them on a server, and they have to be managed. So we need to find a way to simplify the journey from ingest, data preparation, storage, curation, and then consumption. The last one is a real no-no, the manipulation of data manually. And I have still seen that happen today, where files come into organisations and people open the file and they actually go in and add extra commas, or they'll remove special characters just because one line doesn't work. So people still use tools like Notepad++ to do searches for particular text or particular characters, and then make those changes, whether it's by hand or using regular expressions and then replacing values. All of these things require a lot of hard work, and they're all subject to human error. If we look at an example to solving nested JSON for the first example here, to write it in Python, most people would iterate through the actual file. So in the case here, what we're trying to do is decide, well, okay, if a file is a JSON object and we see that there's a particular object and then there's an array or a list of items within the object, we actually go through and say, well, okay, if the type is a dictionary, because we've transformed the data from being JSON into like a Python object, we create a function that says, hey, I'm looking to see if this is a dictionary. If it's not a dictionary, is it a list? If it's not a list, we'll then just output the value. Now, this is all good as long as the JSON data is valid. And in a lot of cases, there'll be wrong characters in the data, there won't be fully completed objects, and the iterators fail. So you've got to have lots of tries and catches, and it becomes a real mess. In the case of the big data solution, the same thing happens. We have to load data in from a large data store. We have to work through whether there is a branch or there is a leaf of data. We've got to iterate through those, but to write that particular algorithm is hundreds of lines of code. And again, in these particular scenarios where you need to unnest or unpick data, whether it is JSON or CSV, it actually requires a lot of custom work because there will be conditions you need to put in place. There's also libraries in Python like simple namespace, which allows you to dynamically load attributes against an object. Instead of using an object type, you're able to use a namespace type and actually dynamically add attributes against that particular type. Now, this is okay, but again, if the data is messy or it's missing particular attributes and it's not like the structure of the object isn't regular, like it's the same in each entry, the data, when it goes to load, can fail. So again, we need conditions to manage it. So there's a lot of heavy lifting just to get the data out before we can even get any insights. So what we need to do is find a way to accelerate our delivery of data from source to destination. And AWS Glue DataBrew does that very easily. It's able to visually prepare data in a way that most other data, or how would you say that? I would say the other tools that you have are much more clunkier to actually work with. I'm going to demonstrate that tonight. So you'll be able to prepare data up to 80% faster than you did before. So whether you want to normalize data, transform data, you'll be able to do it at speed, and you'll be able to integrate these processes across multiple data stores on AWS. So, looking at DataBrew just from a high level, there's 5 components that make it up, or 5 features. The first one is you're able to create a data set from S3 or from a database of some sort on AWS, and then you're able to profile the data. Now, profiling will allow you to see how many rows of data there are, how many columns there are, whether there's missing values, is there correlations between the data, and so on. Once the data has been profiled, we're able to, as the data is being imported, set up data quality rules to say, hey, if there's data missing, what do we do? If the values are of this type, what do we do? Do we change those values to something else? And just like in a lot of cases when you're working with data and it's coming in at speed, normally you'll have to write some kind of complex bit of code inside Python or inside Flink or inside even AWS Glue to process this data. Inside DataBrew, you can write a rule in a series of steps and apply that to the data as it's arriving in. The next stage is that we're able to create a project that is made up of recipes. And we're going to have a look at that very shortly. So we can load the data that was profiled, go through and make changes to the data, and we'll go through each of these, or most of these icons across the top of Glue DataBrew in just a moment. And we're able to transform and prepare the data in a visual way. As you go along and you're transforming the data, we're going to have our source data. We're going to have our data set, which has been profiled. We'll have our project and our recipe all visually represented with some data lineage. So we're able to see the flow of the data through the series of steps. Now, finally, the most important step here is that we should be able to automate this. So rather than creating these bespoke pieces of work that require lots of code, lots of trial and error when particular data values are missing or the data is incomplete. We're able to use each of these steps and then automate the onboarding of data either based on an event, such as the data arriving inside Amazon S3 or some other data store, or at a particular period of time. So recipes are a bit like building blocks. You're able to create little sections or little pieces that solve for a particular problem with your data, and you're able to assemble them and create larger recipes. And the reason why you can do that is because the recipes are written in YAML. So even though you may visually select the icons across the top when we go to do a project inside Glue DataBrew, the actual recipes themselves can be taken, joined, and then brought back into DataBrew to create quite complex structures for data transformation. So let's go into the console of AWS and do a bit of a demo. Oh, let me just jump out of that, come back to that in a minute. Okay, so I'm across in the AWS console, and the first thing I want to show you is the working with code with Python and some JSON files. Now, we could be doing this with CSV files, we could be doing this with Avro, Parquet, text files generally. There's a lot of flexibility with working with obviously data on AWS, pretty much infinite opportunities to transform data and different data types. For today though, I'm going to show you some JSON objects, and we're going to look at the challenges of trying to transform that data with code, and then look at how we can use Glue DataBrew to solve a lot of the data transformation problems. So what I've done is I've gone into SageMaker and I've created a notebook instance. So I've got a Jupyter notebook that allows me to go in and work with the code interactively. So I've got that already going, and you'll see inside the actual Jupyter notebook, I've got a couple of notebooks in the Jupyter environment. I've got a couple of notebooks, and I've got some JSON files. Now these could be inside Amazon S3. I actually do have these files also in Amazon S3, but for simplicity and so you can see what's going on, I actually move them into the Jupyter environment as well. Okay, so you may have seen me do sort of a little bit earlier, I was talking about iterators. Now, iterators are where we're able to iterate through rows of data, or in this particular case, we're going to iterate through some JSON. Now, the file that I've got is it's a pretty boring file. We can go and have a look at it. It's this one here. It's just a collection of data, and you can see this just some JSON. It's got some URLs, it's got some types, it's got some coding and so on. So it's nested data, and it is actually quite, it's deeply nested. The thing is though, I don't know what this data is. I need to work with it. So what I'm going to do is try something where I think, well, okay, I can see it's made up of there's some arrays. I can see there's some list of like a list of items. Then there's an object that is wrapped around it. So I'm going to try and iterate on that data. So I've got the file over here, and what I'm going to do is try and flatten the JSON where I'm saying, well, okay, if I've loaded the JSON in, so down the bottom here, I'm going to load the JSON in, you can see down the bottom here, and then I'm going to call this function to flatten the JSON. Now, this is a bit of code that's actually on, if you go and Google it, you'll be able to find it online. Really all we're doing is saying, well, hey, when I've loaded this JSON in, it's appearing as a dictionary for Python, and then we're going to go through and say, well, okay, the dictionary is made up of other dictionaries and other lists because it's transformed that way. And if I go to run this, and you'll see in just a moment, just go run. So I'm going to select this and go run. You'll see, sure enough, I'm able to go through and I can iterate through this data, and this looks pretty good. And there's no kind of faking it here. I'm just showing you that we're just trying to query the top 2,000 rows, and we're iterating through, and we're seeing all the values. Okay, so that all works. So that's all looking pretty good. And hang on, there is actually a problem. And you can see at the very end here, there's obviously something down lower that's not working. So we have to work out what the problem is. I'm not going to work out what the problem is because I just don't have time. If I'm a person who needs to produce insights, I don't want to be sitting here trying to work out code, going, well, what was the one thing that wasn't right here? So this is the first scenario that comes up a lot. People will load the data in, they'll find a bit of code online and they'll run it, and everything's great until it's not. Now, let's try another one. I'm going to remove this particular file. Let's try this farmer's protest tweets. Now I press this one and I'm going to run this bit of code. Okay, this one didn't even go anywhere. So let's have a look at what happened with this one. Now these are seriously these are random files that I picked off the internet just to demonstrate tonight what we can do with JSON files. But the interesting thing is they actually failed when we tried to use this bit of code. So you can see here there's what's this? A bit of extra data on line 2, column 1. So there must be some kind of character that is causing the problem. Again, I'm not going to go into that. What I want to highlight is you can go and do this many times, and you'll get data and you'll go, man, how come this doesn't work? And you'll be getting frustrated rather than actually delivering the benefit. Let's do another one. I was mentioning about simple namespaces. Now, simple namespaces are where we're able to iterate through a JSON file or a CSV file. We can actually add the attributes of the object dynamically to this namespace. Now, what I'll do is I'll just actually take this bit out first. I'll just start like this. So I'm going to load that same file, which was just this file here, which is just a collection of data. I'm going to run this, and we should see an output because we're going to iterate through the data and add the attributes, the different dictionaries and lists to this X variable. So let's just run that. And sure enough, we get the data coming through. That looks pretty good. There's no formatting or anything like that. We did see there was a problem. This one looks pretty good. So this one seems to work okay. Let's try, because remember in the previous example, this file wasn't actually working. So we'll try the farmer's protest one now. So we'll just try this file. It's running. It's a pretty big file. And again, you might have seen before there was that extra bit of data. I don't know what that problem is with that data. Maybe we just have a quick look. So if I go to, where's the farmer's protest tweet? Do we see what it is? It's a big file, so it may take a little minute to load. I'll come back to it. So you can see that this is a real hit and miss way of working with data. Now, this is not pre-cooked, as I say. I've done this to demonstrate that data and cleansing it is really a difficult challenge for a lot of organisations, especially when you rely on third parties to provide the data. Okay, so what did I do next? Well, I went, okay, I can see that this is a bit of a problem. I couldn't get it working. Why don't I go into Glue? And this isn't a criticism of Glue. I love Glue, and I love it because you're able to go in and you can put data in S3 or into traditional data stores that are on-prem or in the cloud and actually crawl, as in search and understand the data in those data stores. Now, what I did was I put the files inside the S3 bucket, and you'll see here are the files. And I said, well, okay, if I'm going to use Glue services, if I'm going to use AWS services, I should be able to use Glue and I should be able to crawl the actual JSON. Because inside Glue, with the crawler, there is a JSON parser. There's a JSON SERDI, which is a serializer, deserializer, which effectively all it's doing, it's going in and saying, hey, I'm going to read the JSON, and if I'm able to work it out, I'm going to convert this into effectively a rows and columns like a traditional data store. Now, I've run this already. It ran for 54 seconds, and I should see some tables added. I've got absolutely nothing. So even though, and I'll just show you the crawler, you'll see here that I've got some data stores which represent the farmers' protests, the Trump's posts, and some WikiHow. So I've got 3 different sets of data, and nothing works. Now, a lot of people will be going, you know what, I knew this would happen. I thought Glue was going to be the answer to everything. It can be, but when data is deeply nested or it's dirty, it does have trouble trying to put the data into the right spot. Now, the way we solve it is generally we use classifiers and try and map the data. That's for another time. So, how did I solve for this? Well, what I did was, let me just do my icon here. What I did was I used Glue DataBrew. Now, Glue DataBrew, if I go to the very start here, is the tool that allows me to do the work easily. To prepare, take the data in from different data stores. Again, it can be a data warehouse like Redshift. It can be a open source database like Postgres or MySQL, which is running on RDS. But I'm going to show you the data that we have with, firstly, the farmers' protests. Now, you may remember when I showed you before, the farmers' protest data didn't actually work. We had trouble getting it to load at all. Now, I've already prepared this one. I'm going to do two, as long as I get enough time here. But I'm going to show you the actual data set that I've already pre-created, and then we're going to do one from scratch. So, as I mentioned before, DataBrew is made up of 5 features, which are creating a data set, having a project that lets you prepare the data using recipes. You're able to set up data quality rules and then automate the actual flow. Let's have a look at the data sets. Now, I've already gone in and said, well, this is where the data set is, and I've created, oh, there you go, you can see I've created the data set and a link to it. There's 1.4 gig of data, and what I've already done is run what's called a data profile. So what does that look like? Well, you sort of saw it before in these slides, but you'll see here, when we profile the data, we're able to understand, and this took a sample of 20,000 rows, there was a lot more data, and we can extend or compress the amount or reduce the amount of data that we want to actually sample. But you can see here it's worked out, well, there's 6 columns that are big integers, there's 9 columns that are strings. I can see that there's 7% that have missing cells or missing values. I can see the distribution of data, and I can get a further understanding of the data, which we'll actually look at when we look at the projects in just a minute, which shows you the distribution of the data as well. It's pretty cool, right? We haven't had to write any code. We're able to understand whether the data is clean or dirty, or we can see whether there's missing fields where there should be fields, and I'm sure most of you will be familiar with getting files delivered to your door from some third party, and even though you get the files every day, there's 0 bytes. Well, we're able to set up rules that manage that to make sure that there is data before we progress any further and set up eventing and alerting. Okay, so we're able to create a data set that refers to S3 in this particular case, do a profile of the data to understand what the correlations are and what the distribution of the data looks like. And then from there, we can actually go in and set up data quality rules. Now, I'll come back to that in just a moment. Let's go to projects. Now, I'm just going to, I won't go to projects here because I've actually got it open in another tab, so let me show you that. Now, this is running live, so there's nothing that's pre-canned or preset here. So what you can see, this is the farmers' protest data. Now, remember before we were trying to run this data inside here, and when we ran it, you'll see that things just didn't go well. Well, we've got a problem with extra data. But when we use Glue DataBrew, it goes in and says, hey, you know what, I'm going to, using my algorithms behind the scenes, I'm going to initially prepare this data so I can read it. And you can see here that I'm able to go in and actually review the data. I can take a good look at it. But most importantly, I'm able to start to prepare and transform the data. Now, for me, there's a lot of information in here that I love to work with. Maybe I want to change the date. Maybe I want to only have the start of the date. Well, I can do that. I can go into up the top here and I can say, well, okay, I want to work with date and I want to format the date. And I want to change it so that it's a year, month and day, or I want to change it to some other format. And I'm pretty sure most of you have worked with the Java formats and tried to transform dates in the past, and you just know how hard it is to get it right in SQL. Well, here I can go in and say, well, I want a date format, I want a year, month, and day, and I say which column it is. So you'll see over here, I've clicked on the icon. It's come across and said, well, which column are we working with? Well, we're working with date. This is the format that I want. I want to do all the rows of data, and now I'm going to preview the change. So this will go through and it'll show you the result. So you get that without having to write any code. Now I can apply that, and I've got my first step completed in what becomes a recipe. Now remember, these recipes are YAML adjacent, and you can actually export them out. But also you can publish them and have version control with them all within Glue DataBrew. So the big thing that I wanted to talk about tonight was working with nested data. Now you'll see here, if we look at media, there's lots of stuff in here, but if I wanted to query this data and it was really deep, how do I get those values out very easily? Well, the way we do it is we can unnest the data. So over here, without writing any code, I'm going to click on this icon, which is Nest to Unnest. I click on Unnest, and I'm going to unnest part of this media data. Now we can go pretty deep here, but I'm going to give you an example of just one particular column. So I'm going to go in here and say, well, I want to work with the media column here, because you can see that it's an object. Okay. And then I'm going to unnest all the top levels. I'm going to go preview changes. So here we go, we're going to go through and get the media data. And here you can see I've taken this now and I've unnested those values. Okay? So we're starting to unnest, and then from there what I can do is I can continue to unnest. I can unnest the unnested and give these new names. So I can call this, like the next one could be unnested duration, unnested preview. I can go further and further in, because you can see here this was the array, and now we've broken this up into more pieces. It's pretty cool, right? In the past, this will be a very challenging piece of work, especially as you go through and you want to unnest more and more. So from here, you can see I've already unnested some data, and I can unnest that again. Now, going through here, I can see there's some other values that have null, so they're quoted tweet. Now, I don't know what I want to put in here. It could be anything. I'm not sure what to do with that. But maybe I want to work with rendered content. Now, I can see in here, there's some hashes in here. Now, with hashes, I can say, well, there could be other characters I don't like. Maybe there's other languages and so on. What I can do is I can click on clean. So I'm going to change the format of date, unnest values, and I'm going to clean some data. And look what I can do. I can go through, I can remove special characters, I can fix up delimiters and so on. So if I go and choose a special character, and I can choose a custom one, and then I can go through and say I want to do the changes to that. I want to clean them all out. I want to get rid of all of those. Well, didn't choose a column. Let me just go and do that. So I'm going to rendered content, and I'm going to preview those changes. And again, what we're doing is previewing the data, and we're going to trim all that out. So we're going to clear out all the ads and the hashes and so on. We don't have to do all of that. We can actually customize what that is. And we actually start to get the data into a state that we can really get some insights from and have it cleaned and ready in no time at all. So from here, I've got a series of steps. I'm just going to go apply to this one. So I've got 3 steps now. And you can see here, change the format, unnest the values, and remove special characters. Now, there's one interesting part that is new to Glue DataBrew, and that's this sensitive feature. If I click on sensitive, look what I can do. If I've got names, passports, values, licenses, credit card information, I can redact values, I can encrypt the data, I can hash the values, and so on. So I'm not going to do this right now. I just wanted to highlight that this is very, very powerful, because in the past, you'd have to write some function to redact the values. So I'll click on it just to show you. I can go in and say, I want to remove particular values from content. And from content, I want to remove certain characters or based on a particular pattern. and then I can put hashes or some other character string in there to replace those characters. So you may want to hide, especially if we did the Trump post, we could remove Trump and put someone else in there for whatever reason. So I'm going to cancel that one out. I'm not going to do that one. But you can see very quickly I can create these particular changes to the data. Now from here, I can download the YAML, download the JSON, and actually join this up with other recipes. So I'm going to publish this, and this is going to be my initial recipe, and I'm going to publish it. So that's been saved, and now what I can do is I can create a job that will produce the output of all of those changes and produce a new data set. Now I'm going to do that really quickly, so I'm going to show you create job, and in here, this is going to be my farmers cleansing job. From here, I can go in and say, well, okay, where am I going to put the data? And look at the options that I've got. You've got so much flexibility. You can go to S3, which is a really common approach. Go to our database connections, which can be on-prem or in cloud. We can use the Glue data catalog, which is where you've already established connectivity to data stores. And we can even go to Snowflake. For here, I'm just going to show you that we can go to S3. I'm going to save it as Parquet. I can then save it as Snappy, and I can save it into a particular location. So I can go back into my bucket, do a DataBrew output, and I'll just go select. And from there, I can set up a schedule when the job should actually occur. And I can create a schedule. I can say it's recurring. And I can say daily. I'll just, do you know what, I'll leave it as 2023. And we do every day. And we can go to add, right? So we put a particular schedule in. And then from there, I say, as always, with AWS, you've got to give permissions to actually do this particular step and actually have access to S3 or whichever data store, and then we can create and run the job. So that's the series of steps. Now these jobs can be run based on an event as well, and I just want to jump back and show you an example of that back in the slideshow. So what we could do is this. We could actually have the data arriving in a data lake. So whether you've used any of our data lake methods to create a data lake environment, you're able to have the data arrive in the data lake, which triggers an event when the data arrives in a queue, when the actual event arrives in a queue. Then we can use a Lambda to trigger a repeatable process. Now that repeatable process can include DataBrew, where we say, well, we've got that recipe, we've got that particular job, and when we know it's the right data coming in, we can say, hey, this is a new update to a particular data set, and kick off the DataBrew transformation. Once the transformation is complete, we can continue on with the step function, a series of steps that goes and crawls and updates the Glue catalog with the data, which allows you to immediately then query the data with Athena or with Redshift or whatever method you're using to query the data, or whatever data store you're using. So you can see here this is very powerful because we can go from having no code to creating a visual pipeline that is very complex with transformations, and you're just using icons to do those particular steps. Okay, now I mentioned we were going to look at how we can do this from the start. Now I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to take you through the series of steps, plus also a little bit about the data quality rules before I finish up. So I'm going to connect to a new data set. I'm going to go and you can see here, I'm going to create a new connection. This will be the Trump posts, which is disappointing, but that's what we're going to do. I'll put a dash in there. I'm going to go and choose the location of where that data is inside S3. I'm going to go into the sample data, and I'm going to choose Trump posts. I'm just selecting that folder, and I know it's JSON, and we know it's not working too well, so we know it's got one. I think it's got lots of it's not just one entry, it's multiple lines. And I can choose whether I filter the data or so on. At the moment, I'm just going to go down and go create the data set. So there is my data set. Now, when I click on this, you can see that I have the data, but I have no data profile. So I don't really know what the data is. Now, remember, when I was doing the test before, the data wasn't working at all. I couldn't read it. What I'm going to do is create a data profile job, which will profile the data and allow me to go through and work with the actual, interact with the data. So I'm going to run the data profile. And this will just be a profile job that I can do the full data set. Let's do that. And the data, I'm going to save the output of the job, which is just all the results from the job. I'm going to save that back into S3. So I'm going to save that in the DataBrew output folder. And down here, now this is another important component. Look at this. I can go in and say, when I'm doing the profiling, do I want to include duplicate values? The other one is this. I can go in and say, hey, do I want to enable PII statistics? Do I want to understand whether there's any personally identifiable information? I can put that on. I'll leave it off for right now. And there's actually another feature for managing correlation using a couple of different algorithms. Actually, there's only this one here at the moment. I don't know why, but there's only the one. And we can go through, and from there we can then create and run the job. We could set up a schedule to do that, but I'm just going to create and run the job. Hopefully I've got it all. I didn't choose a role. So you can see in here, I need to make sure I've got authority. I've got to grant authority to Glue DataBrew to access S3, and I can create and run the job. So we can go in, point to Amazon S3, query the data, go up here. Let me just go, it's running now, I have to go back to it in a minute. We're able to go in and choose whether we want to look at profile with duplicate rows and also look to see whether there's any PII values. Now this takes a few minutes to run, so what I'll do is I'll leave you there with that. The final thing that I want to cover off in the last minute are data quality rules. As part of the preparation of the data, we're able to establish data quality rules. I'll go across and choose our original data set here, farmers one. And what we're able to do is set up data quality rules where we can say, hey, this is going to be my DQ. I'm going to put DQ rules. Give me just a moment. Actually, I haven't got one in now. I've got to create one. Apologies. I'm just going to go and create one. And I'm going to just call it DQ rules. And I can choose the data set. And I just wanted to highlight what these are. So there's not much to this, but it's very, very powerful. Because you can see in here, I can say, hey, I want to individually check each column. And what is my check? I'm going to say, well, I want to see if there's missing values. Or I want to see if there's particular valid values in there, or are there outliers? And I'm able to set up conditions based on those particular data quality checks. So I'll leave that for you to do in your own time, but just be aware this is a very powerful feature which normally involves a lot of other steps as you're bringing data in to stage it, curate it, and then make it available to other consumers. With that, I'm going to jump back to the presentation and close out the session. So what we've covered off is the challenges that we've seen with working with data, whether it's dirty data, whether it's missing data, or whether it's really complex data. Glue DataBrew allows you to go in, prepare, validate, and then clean up all of that data without having to write a single bit of code. The great thing about it is that we're able to then integrate Glue DataBrew in with other AWS services that are either data stores for the data sources, and also the eventing part of AWS, which can be EventBridge or CloudWatch events, or even a Lambda trigger from Amazon S3. So when the data arrives, there's a lot of functionality and there's a lot of power. I've got some links here that you can refer to. One thing that you might have seen when I was presenting was there was a Glue Parquet writer. I really wanted to highlight that because there's a blog here that talks a little bit more about how it works, and it's great when you've got data that you aren't sure what the data type is. The Glue Parquet writer is a lot more flexible than the traditional Parquet writer that exists for Spark, for Apache Spark. And with that, that is the end of the show. So thank you very much for taking the time to hear about the challenges, how you can solve them with Glue DataBrew. And with that, I'll hand it back to our Master of Ceremonies, Brian Fay.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul, for that great presentation. If anyone's got any questions for Paul, feel free to drop them into that chat. We'll more than happy to have a bit of a chat and answer anything that you might want to ask Paul about any of that fantastic. So to wrap up, as usual, I'd like to put a couple of things out there. First of all, what do you want to hear? We always love hearing from people in the community about the topics that interest them. So if there's something in particular that you'd like to see us try to get presented for, or if you yourself have something that you're interested in presenting for us, please reach out through Meetup or through the chat box on Twitch there. We would love to hear from you with any of those ideas. Lastly, submit your feedback. So if you registered through our Meetup site, you should get a notification there to submit feedback for the event. We do check it every single month, and it helps us make sure we keep bringing you the best possible content. And lastly, as always, friends, don't let friends miss the Canberra AWS User Group. Word of mouth is the best way for us to spread what we're doing here. So if you liked what you saw and thought it was interesting, share a link with your friends. Tell them about the live Twitch sessions, or if you're watching this on YouTube, share a few links around. Otherwise, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. We'll be back again next month with more fantastic AWS content as always. And on that note, we'll wrap up. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.